Hi guys, in this video I'm going to show you how I painted this pale yellow peony flower step by step. There are a couple of key watercolor techniques that you will see me use, and I think these will come in handy in your next watercolor painting, whether it's a botanical subject or an animal or a bird or a landscape. So technique number one that I'm going to show you is how to apply masking fluid. Technique number two that you will see is negative painting, and this comes all the way to the end, so stick around and you'll see what I'm doing with my leaves, where I first cover the entire background and actually go back with a darker green color and paint around my leaf shapes, and that really helps me create a cohesive background with enough detail to have some visual interest, but not so much that I'm taking away from the beautiful flower in the center of my composition. Finally, I will give you some tips on how to understand light when painting a botanical subject, and you will get a good sense of my thinking process when I'm choosing the colors for different parts of the painting. Enjoy. If you like what you see, don't forget to subscribe. So let's take this to the table and I'll take you through the process. So the first step of my painting process is usually to mask the white parts of the painting. So I'm looking at my reference picture and I put my masking fluid in my palette, and I'm using my rubber color shaper, and I'm gently just tapping and putting a little bit of the fluid on paper. There are two types of masks that I'm going to apply. The first one is larger areas, such as the one I'm doing right now, and the other type is very thin lines. You can see I'm just dragging my color shaper down, and this is to add some texture, something that would be really difficult to do with a brush without masking fluid. So what I'm going to do is go through the entire flower, and looking at my reference photo, just mark those highlights with the fluid. And that way I know that the white paper is protected. I can paint over it once the masking fluid is dry. And later on you will see me erasing the masking fluid in the final stage, and I'm going to make some little corrections, but for now you can see the masking fluid is drying out and it's becoming a bit yellow, so I can see it when I'm painting, and I will give it maybe half an hour to dry completely before I start the next phase of the painting. So step two is my background layer, and this is the part of painting where I'm not going to put any details, so just the large areas of color, starting with a very soft yellow wash on the stamens, and I'm using cadmium yellow, and I'm adding just a little bit of orange there, but no more than that. There are no other details at this stage. Now for the rest of the flower, I'm gonna first cover everything with a thin layer of water, and I'm using my larger squirrel brush, and then I'm gonna go in with my yellow color, and I'm just going to put it down and see how it spreads. I'm also using a little bit of my warm green. Right there at the bottom, I'm going to add a little bit of blue. Now, blue is not the color that's natural for this flower, but I'm looking at the source of light, and I know that the parts of the painting that I want to set back visually need to be cold. So I'm going to choose these blue colors carefully, and I'm going to apply them strategically just in the areas that are away from the sun. And if you saw my recent video on my favorite pigments, those are the two blues that I'm using here, ultramarine and Windsor blue green shade, which is a type of phthalo blue. So you can see that I'm leaving some of the areas of the petal completely white, and those are the ones that are, in my opinion, the most light, and I'm going to come back to them later on. And I'm covering the ones that are darker and more saturated with my yellow, my light warm green, and at the bottom I'm using a bit of blue. A little bit of olive green in the middle, and a little bit of red. Now I'm ready for my definition layer, which is the third step, and this is where I'm going to start defining areas of light and shadow, and you're going to see a lot more detail at this stage. So I'm going to accentuate my shadows and my highlights. I'm going to use much more pigmented colors, and I'm using wet on dry technique here, meaning that my background layer is completely dry and I'm painting my shadows mostly with a very hard edge. So you can see I'm using the same colors but in a much more saturated manner. So the blues and the greens, I'm going to double down there at the bottom where my flower is in the shadow. I'm also going to pay attention to the middle of the flower because it's covered by some of the petals, and so it's going to have much more color and be much more saturated. I'm also adding a little bit of that red that I see in the reference photo, and I'm just watching it spread. I'm adding a bit more of hooker's green and a bit more of phthalo turquoise now, just to really make sure that those shadows are deep. The phthalo blue I'm using right now is quite vibrant, but I'm not afraid to use it because my background is going to be so much darker. I'm starting to introduce a bit more warmth in the shadows, so you can see me dropping a bit of dioxazine purple, and as I move closer to the top of the flower where the light is coming from, the shadows that are going to be there, I'm going to have a lot more warmth, so that's where the purple is going to come from. Now I'm coming back to the middle of the flower, and now I'm going to define the red areas a little bit more. Going with my Winsor Newton Series 7 Kolinsky sable brush here, and I'm really taking advantage of the tip of the brush to paint smaller details. This is my Daniel Smith Bordeaux color. Not the brightest red, but I like it. I think it matches the rest of the palette quite well. I don't want to use any pinks or any corals. I really want this color to be dark and saturated. Now I'm going back to my side petals, and again with my phthalo blue, adding more and more definition to the shadow. And you can see that I'm getting more and more fine and detailed with my strokes. A little bit more purple. Those shadows in the middle of the flower are quite warm because they contain reflections from other yellow petals. So I don't want to use a lot of phthalo blue here, using purple instead. And as I move down, more blue. And now it's time for the accent layer, which is where we're going to accentuate those shadows one more time and really help boost those highlights by making the shadows darker. I'm also going to use the tip of my brush quite a bit more in this stage to create some detailed textures on the petals and the stamens. So you can see me working a lot more in this stage on top of the flower. We left it almost white in the first two layers, so I'm going to come back and add some color there. But before I do that, I'm going to make my shadows a bit darker. And again, I'm not afraid to put another layer of color here because my background is going to be so dark that the flower is going to pop. So again, the logic here is the same. Looking at the direction of light, top to bottom, I'm going to apply a lot more blues on the bottom petals and a lot more warmer greens and purples on top. Also, if you're counting, this is now the third or the fourth time I'm applying color to the bottom layers, so they're gonna come out looking a lot darker, and my top layers are gonna be quite light because for the most part I'm just applying one layer of color. And now it's time to do the background layer on our greenery. So As I mentioned in the beginning of this video, I'm going to use a negative painting technique, meaning I'm going to cover everything with a layer of color, and I'm using a large synthetic squirrel brush from Escoda here, and I'm just going to use my phthalo turquoise with a little bit of warm green on the areas where the leaves are going to be, but I'm not so worried about defining the shapes right now. I just want a nice even layer of color that I can work with later on. So you can see me using some ultramarine, and the more blue I use, and ultramarine will help me in this case, the more blue I use, the further away those areas will appear. And now that it's drying out, I'm gonna go back with the same palette of colors, and I'm gonna start painting around my leaves, and this is what negative painting looks like. So a darker layer of color defining the shapes of the leaves. So again, when I did my first layer, I put an even wash, but I dropped a lot of warm greens around the areas where the leaves are going to be, and more sort of turquoise and ultramarine in other areas. Now that the background layer is dry, I'm gonna go with much more pigmented phthalo turquoise, in some cases ultramarine and even purple, and I'm gonna paint around the leaf shapes. So you can see leaves are sort of starting to emerge, and I'm adding more and more colors. So this is again sort of a wet on wet technique, but I'm leaving the leaves dry. And I'm using a Perla synthetic brush from Escoda here because it has a nice tip, and I can get into those smaller areas around the leaves and really define those shapes. I'm gonna do this several times until I'm happy with the saturation. And you can see me using more blue and more purple closer to the edges of the leaves, and this will really help make them stand out more. Darker, cooler colors towards the edges of the leaves and lighter colors all around. I'm gonna keep turning my painting around and applying the same technique. Now, if you remember when we were painting the flower, I noted that the source of light is all the way on top. So I want to keep that logic going, and I'm gonna add a bit warmer color on top just to make sure that there's some differentiation visually from top to bottom. I'm gonna keep my top right corner a lot warmer and lighter than my bottom part, and that may require another layer of color at the bottom, just to make sure that that logic applies not just to the flower but also to the background. I'm gonna go back to my leaves and paint some details within them. So now that the background layer is dry, I can accentuate those details within each leaf, and I'm gonna use the same Dioxazine purple, a little bit of red on the tips, maybe the same Windsor green as a base, and just paint a really light wash. I don't want them to be darker than my background, but I do want some details there. The key here is to keep the details to the minimum so that the flower remains the center of the composition. So you can see me kind of defining some of the veins, but not all of them. And that way we have 3 layers. One is a background layer which has no details, then the leaves with some more detail, and finally the flower, which is the most detailed one. And to the viewer's eye, this will ensure that the flower is the object that stands out. I'm going to finish off my leaves by applying a little bit of red on the tips. This will help me differentiate the leaves from the background. And even though these are not present in the reference photo, I've painted a ton of peonies in my life, so I know that a lot of them have really beautiful red transitions on the tips, and so this will help me not only differentiate it from the background but also kind of tie it together visually with the yellow flower that has a lot of red in the center. I'm using that Daniel Smith red Bordeaux color that I've used on the flower to paint those tips, and I'm blending them with the green so they're not as bright and pigmented. This is really just for visual interest. Again, this is not in my reference photo, but I prefer it that way because it keeps my palette cohesive. Now it's time to erase the masking fluid and reveal the white parts. Some finishing touches on the flower. All I'm gonna do here is go in with my very thin brush. This is a synthetic Kolinsky sable brush from Escoda, and I'm just going to fix some of the mistakes that transpired when I was applying the masking fluid, and I'm going to outline some of the petals and add just a bit of texture and contrast all around. This is about 6 hours of painting in real time, but I try to be as detailed as possible with my explanations, and I look forward to your feedback as always. Have a great day, and I'll see you guys next week.